Welcome, everyone. Today is April 2nd. Can you believe we're already into April? The year is going by very quickly, and spring can get here anytime it wants. I welcome it. I invite it. If it hasn't been officially, if the gold leaf invitation hasn't gone out yet, consider it out now. Today, we are going to be doing training with our good friend uh, Ben Fisher, who is a Senior Business Data Analyst here at NEMSIS. And he is going to be talking to us about partnering with states on research. We do a presentation similar to this every once in a while so that we can get an update on research and how it's going. This is a huge part of Ben's job, and it's really exciting to see what people are doing with the data that everyone's collecting. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass the time over to Ben and let us know what's going on here. Sure, excited about it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I'm Ben Fisher. I help researchers use and understand the NEMSIS EMS data. Today we'll talk about a couple recent papers that were published and kind of their relevance to EMS and how they use the NEMSIS data and maybe affected clinical practice and the policy implications of them to kind of make sure that the way the data is used is relevant. Right now, everyone's muted. You probably can't come off mute, but if you do have a question, please type it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll work to get you either unmuted or answer your question in the chat. And Joe, I'm actually in Minnesota and it's dumping snow as well. So Chris is, hopefully sending out spring thoughts for all of us where it's currently very wintry. For those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with the NEMSIS data, we produce a research data set that each spring, typically. We'll talk a little bit more about when the next one will be available. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit about how it's used, how the Technical Assistance Center supports researchers, and then what to do if you're interested in requesting the research data from the TAC. It is freely available, and for those of you who have requested it in the past for a while, probably remember when it came on CDs or on USB thumb drives. It's now available as a download link, which has certainly made it a lot more convenient to receive the research data sets. So as of 2022, we received data from 50 states, DC, and 3 territories, and it's about 14,000 EMS agencies, which have gotten us pretty close to a census of EMS data. So for researchers, this kind of creates an interesting problem. You almost no longer need to perform statistics. It just sort of is what you find in the data set, which is an interesting problem to have. I've never worked with a data set quite as complete as this, where estimates are pretty close to what we think is actually occurring in the environment. The 2023 data will again have 54 states and territories from about 14,000 agencies. We're anticipating it being around 54 million EMS activations. We got one fairly large population center began reporting as well that has driven that number up. So it is a very large number of EMS activations that are both reporting, and as EMS certainly has gotten busier, we're seeing more and more activations that for researchers can create an interesting problem we'll talk a little bit more about, just because the data sets are getting quite large. And especially if you're looking at all of the V3 data from 2017 to 2022, it can get pretty big. It's, the research data sets are each in relational tables and is a little over right around half a terabyte. And then for those of you who are maybe not familiar with our data standard, the TAC has been providing version 2 data from 2009 to 2016, and we have research data available in version 2 from 2010 to 2016. And then in 2017, the TAC transitioned to V3 data, the third major version of the NEMSIS data standard. And so looking at this table, you'll notice that the size of the data set decreased a little bit just because agencies were transitioning between those versions. And so the count decreased and the reporting states decreased during 2017 as that transition occurred, and then came right back up in 2018. So if you look at Google Scholar and just type in NEMSIS, it comes back with a little over 1,800 results. So that's a mix of primary citations, primary data sources for retrospective data, as well as citing additional, studies that have used NEMSIS in their methods, limitations, or conclusions. So as a research data source, it has gotten very robust. It is well cited, and it has been used in a lot of studies, everything from kind of primary journals like Resuscitation and JAMA, pre-hospital emergency care, all the way into some other journals. So, in terms of like, I believe it's Altimetrics that sort of track the citations. We're kind of getting up there. It's become a pretty robust data source that is been well used in the research field. So that's really exciting for us. So I'm going to talk about a couple studies. Please ask any questions in the chat if you have any. I've got links to the actual articles that we'll talk about. And just keep in mind, this is going to be a really kind of high level overview. I picked a couple of these again, just because I thought that they had kind of direct implications in terms of how EMS data and the NEMSIS data set in particular can be used for retrospective observational studies. And, I don't know, personally, I thought they were kind of interesting. So the first one is a study, and all of these are from around 2023. The first one is a study that looked at retrospective use of EMD protocols to see if it changed ROSC and improved out of hospital cardiac arrest survival. This one was, fairly large. So in terms of cohorts, it was 241,000 out of hospital cardiac arrests, and then they narrowed it to 96,000 in the research sample in the actual patient cohort. So again, this is, kind of an enormous sample size for any sort of research paper. It actually creates some interesting problems because you'll start to see some significant things like p-values just because the samples are so large. In this particular study, patients who received EMD instructions had an adjusted odds ratio of 1.13 of ROSC. And the paper goes into some of the limitations associated with that and the fact that, you can't really assign causality to that. But if you go back and look at some of the confounding variables and adjust even for those, the odds of survival if you receive EMD prior to arrival during a cardiac arrest improves the odds of resuscitation, so ROSC. And for those of you who are very familiar with our data standard, know that we have tried to harmonize our data elements with the National Academy of Emergency Medical Dispatchers. So the eDispatch 01 values are harmonized with those EMD cards, which makes something like this doable and fairly accessible because the cardiac arrest variables and the dispatch variables are fairly well harmonized between the dispatch standard and our cardiac arrest variables, as well as something like CARES, the cardiac arrest registry, to enhance survival. The next one has been, increasingly common in terms of broad topics. So the next two papers focus on racial and ethnic disparities. This is something that's becoming much more frequent both in EMS research as well as at the agency and community level. So in terms of EMS data collection, federal grant programs, community data, we're seeing an increased emphasis on collecting accurate and meaningful race and ethnicity data. There have been some, recent court cases even that have focused on EMS race and ethnicity data collection. The Office of the National Coordinator, which is responsible for collecting and standardizing a lot of the EMR data that's collected at the hospital, has put a pretty significant emphasis on accurately collecting race and ethnicity data. So this is something that I think you'll see a pretty renewed focus on in the sort of EMS data collection, education, as well as the data standard. As a bit of an aside, the NEMSIS uses an Office of Management and Budget (OMB) standard for how we collect race and ethnicity that allows us to collect race and ethnicity in the same list as a multi-select list. So for researchers, that's of particular importance just because it will always be a multi-select list instead of two individual elements. And again, if that's something you're ever interested in researching, we've got some strategies for sort of how to pick that apart. But certainly we'll see more of this. In this particular study, they looked at penetrating trauma adjusted for income as well as with race and ethnicity. And they looked at 87.5 million EMS activations. So again, kind of a staggering research population. And then they linked it to median household income and American Community Survey race and ethnicity data. So this is a good example of one of the services we offer. Our statisticians can link to other particularly demographic data sets, and that allows us to do things like look at population information that's not contained in our data set while preserving our de-identification requirements for not identifying any state, county, zip code, or EMS agency. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like if you're a researcher who's interested in that. But the results here were kind of interesting. In 2020, there were odds of increased trauma across the board. So there were some popular news articles kind of talking about an increase in violent crime after the pandemic and sort of during the pandemic. And it looks like some of those were a little bit borne out. That data, I think, will probably get picked apart for quite some time. But this particular study found an increased rate of penetrating trauma in general and significantly more for Black communities. So Black communities had higher odds of trauma in all years with an adjusted odds ratio of 3.0, and then the 95% confidence intervals were pretty close on either side of that 3. So even when you adjust for income, it reduced the disparities for Black and Hispanic Latino communities compared to white communities, but it was still significantly higher than white communities. So also kind of interesting that the income reduced the disparities, but it was still significantly higher than the white community. And then the next study that also looked at disparities is racial and ethnic disparities in the provision of bystander CPR. So this one was interesting in that they looked at whether or not race and ethnicity affected whether or not you were going to get CPR if you had a cardiac arrest, either in or out of your home. So they looked at location as well. And Black or Hispanic persons were 23% less likely to receive bystander CPR than white persons when the cardiac arrest occurred at home, and 31% less likely than a white person when the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest occurred not in the home. So again, both these papers, I kind of mentioned that they emphasize the need for good race and ethnicity data collection, but obviously this also has clinical implications in the sense that EMS clinicians need to be collecting this data as best as possible. And, there will probably be renewed education in sort of how to approach that relatively sensitive subject, as well as policy implications. So clearly you can imagine that if there is a disparity in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest survival or bystander CPR, then those policy actions or implementations can target communities that may be adversely affected by these rates. So, that's kind of a very big picture, high level view, but those two in particular were interesting. Okay, so moving into kind of another, contentious topic in EMS is airway management stuff. I think anyone who's been in EMS for a while has been listening to this kind of continuous debate about advanced airway management in EMS. This paper by Chris Gage and Dr. Wang out of NREMT looked at very long-term trends of airway management and out-of-hospital cardiac arrest management. This was published in Resuscitation. This one is remarkable both in the volume of data. It was 320 million EMS activations, but also in terms of the time. So it is 10 years of longitudinal data. So there are only kind of a handful of data sets that have this continuous data standard across that lengthy period of time. So to have 320 million EMS activations across 10 years is very powerful. This paper, because it looked at 10 years of data, had to do a crosswalk across the version 2 to version 3 standard, and we have some standardized tools for how to do that. It is it's work, but it is doable, and it has a kind of incredible value because it gives you such a lengthy period of time to do data analysis from. This particular paper found some interesting things. So endotracheal intubation decreased and supraglottic airways increased. I think anyone who's been practicing in EMS for a while, that maybe isn't a huge shock. But there were some interesting findings. So in urban environments, supraglottic airways became more common. They went from about 27 to 39%. And then suburban and rural endotracheal intubation was more common with no real change. And so that kind of brings up this question of, has clinical practice stagnated in those suburban and rural environments where maybe there's less frequent change in practice, less education? I mean, it doesn't really provide an answer, but it certainly begs the question of why there might be a difference by urbanicity. And then in addition to that, this paper then helped inform a evidence-based guideline that was published earlier this year. So in addition to some other work, I believe NHTSA actually funded this one, but the EBG for pre-hospital airway management provides expert consensus about pre-hospital airway management, and it used multiple data sources, but one of the ones that was included for one recommendation in particular used NEMSIS, and it showed that the success rates were similar between medication-assisted endotracheal intubation and supraglottic airway. It basically continues to inform clinical practice for airway management. Now, this particular recommendation was qualified. The evidence is kind of middling because it was an observational review of the NEMSIS data, but when you look at the analysis as a whole, it is what informed these guidelines. And that kind of goes back to, with any large practice change, you start with one study or perhaps a case report, and then you begin to build that foundation of the pyramid as it moves up into out of these anecdotes into individual studies, and then that body of evidence begins to inform a larger body of evidence that eventually become things like randomized control trials and meta-analyses that are more robust reasons for changing and informing practice. So I thought that one was kind of a good example of where that can certainly go. And please feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand if you guys have any questions about any of these papers as I run through them. So let's talk a little bit about sort of what we offer and how these researchers in particular perhaps got here. I will say that we do offer a public data cube. So if the research data sets are perhaps out of reach, or if you, as I mentioned, they're quite large, you don't have access to statistical software, we do have a public data cube. It just uses login information that's available on the website. There are instructions as well as several YouTube videos for how to use it. And then if ever you start using the cube and you have questions, we're always happy to set up a one-on-one training with you where we can work through your question and provide assistance with the cube. That being said, it does have an upper limit. The cube has aggregate statistics only. You won't be able to get individual line level records that would allow you to perform statistical analyses on, but it's great for aggregate statistics. Right now, we keep the previous 2 calendar years and year to date, so almost 3 years of data in it, just because the data has gotten so large that you can imagine that's between 120 and 160 million records and several relational tables, and it can get quite slow. That being said, if you're looking to do multiple filters and joins in the cube, there's sort of this upper limit where we'll eventually steer you towards either one of our statisticians or the research data sets, just because the cube may not be able to handle a very complicated or large query. So what do we offer for researchers? And like I mentioned, if your query for the cube is too large, we have people who can help. So I'm certainly available. This is a fairly significant portion of my job, is to be able to help researchers understand the data as well as how to use it, as well as a little bit of understanding how EMS operates so that help understand the data you're looking at and its practical implications. We have a pool of master's level statisticians, a PhD data scientist, as well as some of the faculty in the data coordinating center who are available. And they are usually happy to help with analysis questions. And we're more than happy to help answer any question you have, even if it means referring it to them. One of the more common things we help researchers do are the masking and de-identification I mentioned. So if you are interested in stratifying a research analysis by county or state or zip code, we can work with you to create an additional table that will allow you to do that while meeting our de-identification requirements. So frequently that is an additional supplemental table. And it would just allow you to look at, state A, county one, without actually identifying those. And we can also link to those additional data sets without identifying them. So you'll see things like the CDC Social Vulnerability Index or the Area Deprivation Index. We frequently use American Community Survey and census data for demographic information, like the study that used median income, as well as race and ethnicity data. So there are lots of external data sources that we can potentially link to, as well as a custom data source. So currently we have a couple of researchers who are using their research group's climate data, and we are working with them to de-identify, mask, and link that back to EMS data in a way that is allowable. So if you are a researcher who has a specific data set that you need to link to EMS data, we can work with you with that. We also handle unique data requests. So our statisticians will frequently get requests for summary tables or, sort of pre-computed analysis. We're happy to help with those as well. A lot of times it's summary tables that are too large for the data cube, but we can certainly work with you to provide analysis or do exploratory analysis if you want to see if something's worth pursuing. And then we will help with manuscripts. So we're more than happy to co-author with a researcher and or even just review a manuscript, particularly the portions that are relevant to NEMSIS, to make sure the data was applied and used correctly. And we've done that pretty extensively, and we're always happy to do that. And then just general data support. So frequently we'll receive questions specific to the data, the format, things like that. And we are always happy to answer questions, related to that. The only caveat there is we won't necessarily provide IT help in the sense that we may refer you to your own organization's IT folks if you're having problems with either your statistical software or your hardware, just because it's not really possible for us to provide specific support to that. So to get started, we have quite a few resources that are available. So if you're really unfamiliar, we have a NEMSIS 101 page on our website that provides a really good overview of sort of how NEMSIS works, what NEMSIS is, and will help familiarize you with a lot of what we do with the data. And then in terms of the research data, there's some tools that are particularly useful. So a user manual for the research data set is available for each year of research data. And that describes what variables are in what tables for the relational tables, as well as the unique and foreign keys for each of those research data sets. So that document in particular is very helpful. It also contains some information about the research data, some metadata, a little bit of information about how the data are cleaned. So in addition to the validation rules that occur for both the schema and schematron, when we get to the research data set cleaning, mostly what we do are truncate really large values that would be abnormal. So they're a little stricter than some of the schematron rules. But pretty minimal data cleaning just because the data is so clean when it arrives, and that is described in the user manual as well. And then we also have the 3.4 and 3.5 data dictionaries that are available. An important note is the research data sets will only have national data elements, though that's all we receive at the TAC. And right now, all of the research data is in version 3.4. And then this year's data set will be produced it will be mapped from 3.5 to 3.4. And then we also have some extended data definitions and case definitions. So the extended data definitions are how individual values might be coded based on certain criteria. So you can imagine that there's some subjectivity in certain fields as to how a particular field might be selected. And that document was created with the Data Managers Council to try and standardize some of how those values might be defined and selected. And then case definitions, again, to try and standardize certain things. So you can imagine something like STEMI, which is frequently of interest. We have provided some standardized inclusion criteria, ICD-10 codes. And then for those, we actually provide some example SAS code and I think XML as well, mostly for software vendors, but that would allow you to kind of get ahead of things and be able to use some pseudocode to quickly write any inclusion criteria or case definitions. And then additional research data sources are available on the website. So some things to know about the research. So again, our data use agreements don't allow us to provide specific location data. We can't identify any state, county, zip, or EMS agency, but we can provide those as a supplemental table mast. So if that's something that's important to you for your research, let us know. We can work with you to provide those in a format that meets our requirements while making sure that it's still useful for you. And then again, we talked about linking the data sets. We will work with you to make sure that the locations are not identifiable, meet our de-identification requirements, but are still useful. So obviously, if we remove any sort of variance in the linked table, you can't use it for any sort of statistical analysis, but we want to make sure that it is, it meets our minimum requirements so that you can't reverse engineer a specific location from a unique combination of values, depending on how many variables there are. So you can imagine if the linked data set is quite large with lots of variables, we have to reduce that precision more than if there are fewer variables. And that can be an ongoing conversation. We're always happy to talk and meet with you if you're linking to an external data set to kind of find the largest number of variables and values within it while meeting our requirements. And then finally, the data set is quite large. So the compressed data sets, depending on the format, we offer 3 formats, ASCII, SAS, and Stata right now, are about 15 gigabytes. And then uncompressed, the 2022 data is closer to 150 gigabytes. So the actual research data sets are quite large. And then you can imagine if you're combining multiple years of research data, again, the 2017 to 2022 data sets in the SAS format are pretty close to 500 gigabytes. So we frequently find if you're in an academic institution, reaching out to your IT folks to get a virtual machine with some additional storage can frequently be the easiest way to be able to manage some of the size of the data set. Anne from Arizona has a question. Is the 2024 data going to be mapped? So 2023 will be mapped down. I don't know yet. We haven't started talking about 2024 data yet, but the 2024 data will probably be just 3.5 research data. And then what we do is provide mapping. So there will be resources on our website in a couple different formats, including just a Word document that explains how you could translate between versions so that if you get multiple years of data in different data standards, you would be able to translate between 3.5 and 3.4, or 3.4 and 3.3.4. If you are requesting a supplemental data set or a custom data set or a linkage, there's some things that are helpful for us in the request. So the more information you can provide to us about your project, including a research question, is extremely helpful. The variables and the outcomes of interest are helpful. That helps us know sort of which variables are more important than others. If we need to do rounding or categorization, we may be able to target the variables of interest to preserve some fidelity there. If you, this is kind of a frequent one, and I'm very guilty of doing it when it's external facing, is any jargon or unique terms. If you can help define those, that's pretty helpful, especially for some of our statisticians who may not be extremely familiar with some EMS jargon. It can be helpful to provide some additional information about that. Years of data is also very helpful, because if we're going to mask or link to multiple years of data, we can do that all at once so that the unique maskings are consistent across years. So if you have a masked agency and masked zip code, you would obviously want to be able to track that across multiple years of data. It is very doable if you add supplemental years to your data request. We can go back and try and find the previous maskings, but every now and then we'll have to recreate all of the maskings with the new years, just to make sure that we that they are consistent. And then any sort of file type, so SAS and Stata obviously are proprietary software file types, and then we do offer ASCII data. Some data sets, some supplemental data can go out as a CSV. There are a very small number of tables that include commas, and so then we either have to use a different ASCII format or pipe delimited. The ASCII data in the research data set is a little weird. It's a bit of a historical holdover, but it's got a 3-character delimiter of tilde, pipe, tilde. And so depending on what you're doing, sometimes that can be a little weird to ingest. And then what would you actually like back? So something that can be really helpful for us is if we get a mock table, particularly either a summary cross table for aggregate counts, or for a linked data set, if you're going to provide linked data. Even something as simple as column headers or example data is extremely helpful for us to know what you're expecting when you receive the data. There's nothing worse than having us put a bunch of effort into something, the researcher has been waiting for a while, and then there was just a miscommunication, and perhaps we didn't understand what was expected. So sometimes something like a mock table can be really helpful for us to be able to understand what is expected as the output. How to request the public research data set. So Lori was nice enough to put a link in the chat. And then there's a link on the website. So if you just go to the main website and request at the top menu, request research data, there's information about how to request it. And it will open a help desk ticket that will ask you questions in a form. And as soon as you fill out that form, that'll get routed to one of the either me or one of the other BDAs will review the request and then typically approve it or ask additional questions to try and understand the request a little bit more. And then Anne from Arizona has another question for 2023 that is mapped to V34. How will the new V35 elements that were collected be available? Ones that are not in V3. Oh, okay. Yeah, so for the research data, it will all be it will all appear as 3.4. So we will use the translation documents to convert the 3.5 data to 3.4. I'm like 98% sure on that. So there are other data sources like the Cube and then some other places where you'll see a mix of the data, but for consistency in the research data, you will typically only see one data standard at a time. So I know that's what they did with version, I think it was 3.3.4 data. They waited until there was sort of this critical mass of 3.4 data, and then they converted. But in the meantime, while they had a mix of the two, they converted all the 3.4 data down to 3.3.4. Does that answer your question, Anne?
Okay, I'll unmute. I think so. Part of it was just I wanted to know for those, like, I don't know how those would be mapped back to anything because they're unique for 3.5. and maybe we don't have the answer to that yet. And then I was just typing in a chat too. If there is a translation document used of some kind, I'm sure there will be something. Will that code be available in SAS? I just think it would be helpful because our state is a mix of both. And a lot of states are a mix of both for 2023. And honestly, we still have some in 2024 that slipped in. It'd be great if we could just see how NEMSIS translated 3.5 to 3.4 in case we want to kind of do that with some of ours and use the same logic.
Yeah. So at the end, I'll show you some of the documents that are available. Actually, this really is the end. If you want additional statistical support outside of requesting the data set, just open a help desk ticket. And then, yeah, let me switch screens here and then show you. So in technical resources, mapping and translation is where all of the element mapping and translation documents live. So there are version 3.4 to 3.5 translation tools, and then 3.5 to 3.4 translation tools. These include, documentation in particular that is relevant. So if you actually look at this, there is a just human readable table of sort of how these elements get used. That being said, depending on the element, similar to some of what Anne pointed out, you can lose some of the fidelity that was designed in those additional elements. So let's see here. So what was the example you brought up, Anne? There was a specific element.
Well, there was, let's see, there was like level of care by protocol, which is kind of super important because we're always getting the question of what they actually got for care, whether it's ALS or BLS. And then the other one was that transfer of care, interfacility transfer of care reason. I don't know where those would go back to.
Sure.
Third one is there's going to be a SAS syntax that we could kind of borrow.
Yeah. So no SAS syntax yet, because we are also still writing some of these. I'll have to look, but you can kind of see. So for some of these, you can see how they might be mapped, and in certain cases, so like here's a good example of where the trauma triage criteria essentially maps back to a not value because it didn't exist in 3.4. So it very much depends on the specific scenario. But yeah, there are some criteria that will essentially come back as either a null or a not value.
So will there be any way to request that data? I'm just asking. I'm not trying to make trouble, but
I have this big mute button. You mean request the 3.5 data?
yeah, like if we have a project where that's the kind of stuff we're looking at, we want a national comparison against something that was really can't be mapped back. And we want that level of granularity just compared nationally. Will we be able to request that?
That would be, we would need to have a conversation about kind of what that would look like. And then there would also be the component of you would have to get the 3.5 data from your state vendor as well. But in terms of the national data, I mean, I would say, yes, we could probably get the 3.5 data specific to your project. We would essentially consider it a custom data set request. So we would need to talk about it, scope it. It would take a little bit of time, but potentially, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm happy to answer any other questions anyone else may have. That is kind of the conclusion of the training. I'm happy to provide additional information about the research that was shown here. The papers, a couple of them were behind paywalls, but at least one of them was made freely available. But yeah, if anyone has any questions later, you're always welcome to open a help desk request. And I think with that, I will hand it back off to Chris.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Really appreciate this. This is always one of the more interesting. All of our trainings are interesting, but if you had to compare them, this is always one of my favorite ones. Seeing how all the hard work that everybody's putting together into this is actually moving into betterment of care and into policy. So thank you so much for all the information here. Again, if you have any questions about this or anything you can about NEMSIS related, you can hit nemsis.org. And in the upper right-hand corner, you have an option to send a ticket to us, and we'll get it to the right person. If you want to be so this session was recorded. So if there are any spots in it that you want to revisit, share with your colleagues, you can check out our YouTube channel. This usually goes up within a couple of days. And then you can, like I said, review and share with your colleagues and friends. And if you want to be notified about events like this, you can go to the nemsis.org webpage and sign up for our mailing list. You will get a notification when we are doing this and V3 calls and other events that we'll be having online, and other events that we'll have in person, like the annual meeting. And if you also want to follow along with other information about research that is coming out and using the NEMSIS data, you can follow along on our social media channels, either on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter X. And we put a lot of information of research that uses data from NEMSIS there as well. So thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.